The Hunt Institute is a platform, it's a toolkit for businesses and business people like yourselves. As we'll see here in a minute in the presentation, one of the principal challenges that we face as a region is a divergence of legal structures and also quantitative measurement structures. So what the Hunt Institute is trying to do is create a common frame of reference for business people and investors, even public policy makers in Austin, Santa Fe, Washington, D.C., Austin, and Mexico City. Because as we move from one jurisdiction to the other, everything changes. Tax law changes, franchising law changes, health and safety laws change. So what we're really trying to do is create a common frame of reference for the region and for its businesses and public policy officials so that we can work together as one and leverage our regional assets as a whole. Now, following that principle about how much we are affected and influenced by laws and by laws that are made very far from here is the subject of my presentation today. The presentation will discuss the current state of NAFTA negotiations, particularly with respect to the automotive industry and how that will affect us, and also taking a look at some of the underlying causes of the debates in the NAFTA negotiations with the automotive sector in particular. Finally, the presentation will look at a profile of the supply chains, the commodities that actually course through our region and our ports of entry. So with that being said, I'd like to begin the presentation and look at this document that has played such a critical role in our lives and was negotiated very far away from here and is now under great uncertainty, which is causing great uncertainty for our families, our schools, our business people in the Paso del Norte region. This is NAFTA. This is the law that enacted NAFTA in the United States. And as we all know, the recent presidential campaign of 2016 used NAFTA and this trade agreement as a great scapegoat or as something that was looked on as unfavorable to U.S. interests, particularly manufacturing interests in the Midwest. Now, the current state of these NAFTA negotiations is that we've basically just begun a 7th round in Mexico City. And there's a self-imposed deadline of March 5th to conclude all these negotiations. And while there's been some advances with respect to regulatory matters and even e-commerce, some of the biggest issues remain to be concluded. And some of those major issues deal with our automotive supply chain and the automotive sector. In particular, as many of you may know, one of the major sticking points is rules of origin. And these rules of origin, I think, do need to be updated when we take a look at the trade flows in a minute and looking at what those rules of origin were meant to include and recent technological advances that they have not accounted for in the early 90s. So the idea behind the rules of origin, as many of you know, is so that if the inputs into the finished good, in this case the automobile, derive from the region at a certain level, then that finished good can cross into any of the countries with zero tariffs. Now, if the rules were to go away, then the non-tariff barrier, or the tariff for cars in the United States, to enter the United States, would add 2.5% and 25% for light trucks. Now, the current rules specify that 62.5% of a car must come from within the region. That's US, Mexico, and Canada. Now, there's another issue with respect to a tracing list, and we can talk about that in a second. But one of the issues with respect to rules of origin is that earlier in the 90s and about 20 years ago, cars were less quote-unquote smart than they are now. It seems like I can't get into a car nowadays with touchscreens, LCDs, navigation systems, etc. So a lot of these electronic components, as we'll see in a minute, are, or they have their origin in the supply chains in East Asia, particularly China. And as Secretario Guajardo has said many times, the electronics industry and the supply chains for the electronics industry are deeply rooted in East Asia and China in particular, and don't really necessarily pose a threat to imports into the United States or NAFTA issues. So nowadays, cars are using more and more electronic components for these countries, and if that rules of origin were to be restricted, then that could mean that the cars would not qualify for the zero tariffs that I mentioned earlier. So just to give us a sense of where we are with respect to the negotiating position of the Trump administration and Ambassador Lighthizer, they are proposing for three basically major changes to these rules of origin. One is that the regional content requirement be raised to 85% from 62.5%. Also, they're looking for a new requirement of 50% of U.S. inputs. 50% of those components have to come from the United States. Now, the other issue is this thing called a tracing list. And many of you here in this room surely are aware of this issue because, again, of how rooted our region is in the binational automotive sector. But the tracing list currently is a relatively limited list of goods that need to explain very clearly the origin of the materials. The Trump administration is proposing to basically expand the tracing list to all components. So the current state of negotiations is very uncertain with respect to these issues. Canada has its own thoughts with respect to NAFTA. I would say that it's exclusive to rules of origin. I think they're concerned about other things, particularly their agricultural and dairy sector. But nevertheless, when we're looking at this free trade agreement that includes so many sectors, it's important to realize how dairy farmers in Ontario and the positions of dairy farmers in Ontario could scuttle a renegotiated NAFTA, which would then put in jeopardy our automotive industry here in Juarez and the supply chains between Juarez and Chicago and Detroit and other Midwestern cities. Now, I mention that because it's so important for us to remember how internationally exposed we are. As the Paso del Norte region, we not only have major supply chains and automotive manufacturing present here, but we also have major trade routes that pass through the region. The Union Pacific line, the interstates, the BNSF line that comes down from the Midwest into El Paso and to central Mexico, and even the supply chains that go east of here towards Houston and Dallas. So looking at it from a structural point of view, it's incumbent upon us as a region and as businesses invested in the region to really spend a lot of time thinking about the precarious nature of these trade agreements and how forces in China, in the Midwest, in Ontario, as I mentioned, can really disrupt the lives of our families and our businesses here locally. Now, I want to take a minute and look at the regional and national profiles of manufacturing in Mexico, el estado de Chihuahua, y Ciudad Juárez. And this is important because you'll see that, again, with this question of manufacturing and the role that NAFTA has played in Mexican manufacturing, again, it's very important to understand where we are strategically and how we're situated with respect to these kinds of threats or even opportunities that are coming. So Mexico, as you can see at a national level, it's around 35 to 25% over the past 10 years, 18 years of concentration of employment in manufacturing. Now that's at a national level, so that's just Mexico as a country. But then when you look at Chihuahua, we start to see that the level of manufacturing regionally is much higher than it is nationally. So once again, we're starting to see how more exposed we are as a state and as a tri-state region to any potential shifts in NAFTA or tariffs. Now, when you look at Juarez in particular, we can see that the concentration of manufacturing, concentration of employment in manufacturing is even higher. So as a city, and as businesses located in this city, it's evident that we really need to think strategically about any possible changes to rules of origin or other NAFTA issues. So the other area is looking at the amount of exports by a Mexican state in 2016. And if you look here, the top exporting states in Mexico are Chihuahua, Coahuila, Baja California, and Nuevo León, Tamaulipas. And altogether, if you include Sonora there at number 9, they make up almost about 50% of all Mexican exports to the United States. So this isn't just necessarily a Chihuahua issue. This is something that we share in common with other border states in Mexico. So there's a lot of opportunity for us to work horizontally and east to west with our neighboring communities on the Mexican side of the border to think strategically about how to either take advantage of any changes in NAFTA or to confront any unfavorable results. Now also, with respect to the kind of exports by sector, the border states here, you can see we've calculated the amount of exports from the border states for these goods per sector. But we've also broken it down by state. And if you can see there in the middle, Chihuahua is basically the leader of all the border states. So it's sort of the leader of the leaders with respect to computer equipment and electrical accessories. But it also has a very strong presence with other manufacturing industries and machinery and equipment. So this just underlines again, not only how important our region is to international trade, international manufacturing, binational supply chains, but just as it demonstrates our importance, it also demonstrates the potential threat that we face if there were any precipitous withdrawal of NAFTA or any disruption to regional supply chains. Now this is something else we did just to get a sense of the kind of regional comparison of the labor markets and how they've developed over the last 20 years, basically since NAFTA. And we can see here again how much manufacturing is concentrated in Juarez versus Las Cruces or El Paso. So it's no exaggeration to say that Juarez is really the economic anchor of the region. It's a city that has a very wide and deep base of economic activity. So if Juarez were destabilized, or if Juarez business and industry were somehow affected negatively, that would really hurt all of us as a region. So it's really important for us, again, to think about how New Mexico, Texas, and Chihuahua can really work together to create a united front with respect to binational manufacturing and trade. I want to take a look now briefly at the composition of trade, or the trade flows, and what's going on at the macroeconomic level between the US and Mexico and other countries. So the first slide that I wanted to share with you was just to get a sense of the dollar amount of total US exports, and then that total US export number with respect to Mexico. Now, if you keep that in mind, that Mexico, total exports to Mexico are around $300 billion a year. And then if we look at the other countries that the US exports to, certain countries, we have Canada between 260 and 300 million, and we have China there between 60 billion and 110 billion, increasing, and then we have South Korea and Japan as well. Now, I've included those for a reason, and we'll get back to that in a second as we proceed. So, with respect to imports, the U.S. is importing around 300 billion or so from Mexico annually since 2005. But this is an important graph. It's probably the most important graph of the presentation. We see how imports from China have basically doubled, or close to doubling, since the year 2000, since its entrance into the WTO. And we also have there the relative import values with respect to the East Asian countries, South Korea and Japan. Now, Mexican exports to the U.S., Mexico exports around 80% of all exports to the United States. And we can see here that those are around $25 billion a year. And here, I also wanted to show you the comparative slide of Mexico's macroeconomic trade with Canada, China, South Korea, and Japan. So they're much lower, but we can still see similar trends. Even if the numbers are lower, the lines are relatively in proportional positions. But the interesting thing to note is also how much trade with China, how much Mexico is beginning to import from China. Now, that's exports, but then when we look to imports, we see how much Mexico here imports from the United States, and as with respect to total imports. And then here, this is what I wanted to show you and really emphasize, is the amount of imports into Mexico from China and how that's been, basically tripling over the last 13 years. And that's significant for a lot of reasons. Because the trade deficits that the United States is seeing with China are similar, not necessarily in scale, but at least in proportion and growth to trade deficits that Mexico is seeing with China. But the interesting thing is that the same kind of goods that the US is importing from China are the same kind of goods that Mexico is importing from China. And these, in many ways, were primarily goods from the electronic sector, transistors, televisions, other kinds of electronic goods. Now, going back to the original discussion about rules of origin, the more that these car and auto manufacturers are including from China or East Asia into their cars, with the satellite navigation and the screens and the phones and other materials, that means that non-regional components are starting to make up a greater and greater share of those automobiles. So it's my estimation that in many ways this NAFTA trade agreement that we have in the United States, as I said earlier, has become in some ways a scapegoat for broader US trade questions and broader uncertainties or worries about trade deficits that the US is facing with Asia and China in particular. Because if you look at it, NAFTA has been a very good trade agreement for the US, Mexico, and Canada. But it seems like the US is trying to fight against China with renegotiating rules of origin for the NAFTA treaty. Now, I wanted to also take a look just to show how important we are as a region with respect to our ports of entry and the composition of trade that comes through our ports of entry. So if you look at this with respect to exports and imports and total trade, El Paso is number 2, and number 1 is Laredo. And the important thing to remember about Laredo is how much automotive cars, vehicles go through Laredo on the train. So here's a graph showing the development of imports and exports at the Laredo port between the US and Mexico since 2006. And the imports into Laredo have been growing generally since 2009 and seeing some fall off there just recently in the last 2 years. Same with imports. And these are the top commodities that are going through the port of Laredo. And we see their number 1 is vehicles and other than railway cars. So it's around $50 billion. And then computer-related machinery and parts and electrical machinery, equipment and parts. Now we're comparing this to the Otay Mesa exports and imports as well. And we see, again, a steady growth up until around 2015 and 2016 with respect to both imports and exports. So Otay Mesa is around 20 billion, and Laredo's there around 120 for imports. So with respect to Otay Mesa, their top commodities are electrical machinery and other parts, and also vehicles other than railway. It's in second place. And there in third is measuring and testing instruments. Now with respect to the El Paso exports and imports, we see a pretty steady line. Those dips there relate to the U.S. Financial crisis and the recession, but have clearly bounced back since. But still, we're seeing a drop-off in the last 2 years, both with respect to exports and imports. Now, the top commodities that go through El Paso are electrical machinery, equipment and parts, computer-related machinery and parts, and also vehicles. But vehicles make up the third place here, as opposed to Laredo as number one. Santa Teresa is a growing port. It's been around for about 25 years, and it has seen a significant growth since the financial recession, but still, just like its family members in Texas and California, has also seen a drop-off in 2015 and 2016. And the top commodities that go through Santa Teresa are computer-related machinery and parts, electrical machinery, and paperboard. So the bulk of U.S., we also looked at Albuquerque exports and imports through the airport, and they had some, I don't know what they did in 2007. Maybe they had everybody, maybe that was Breaking Bad, and everybody wanted to buy things from Albuquerque, I don't know. But it has not performed nearly anywhere near as well as the land ports here on the Texas-Mexico border or California-Mexico border. Now, with respect to top Mexican ports of entry, we even did the analysis here and see that Nuevo Laredo and Ciudad Juarez are the top, and Tijuana, in a kind of an interesting twist, because in the U.S. it's really Otay Mesa that occupies that number 2 spot, and here for Mexico it's Ciudad Juarez. And I just would like to mention that, you know, again, just to highlight the binational importance of the U.S. and Mexico, is just these 2 border crossings, Laredo and El Paso, account for 48% of all U.S.-Mexico trade in 2017. So it's no exaggeration to say that we're really at the center of the action. And that can be a very good thing, but it can also mean that when things change in Washington or Ottawa or Mexico City, or even Santa Fe and Austin and Chihuahua City, we're sort of left trying to figure out how to navigate those changes. Now, I also wanted to take a look to show how we're situated with respect to the types of goods that are coming through our region by rail. Now, many of you are aware of how important rail is to our region, both the Union Pacific lines and also the BNSF line. And I would argue that it's really what gives our region significance are the trade routes. Because if you look at the map of the United States, there's very few places where you can cross the Rockies from the Pacific to the Gulf, or from the Pacific to the Midwest or the Atlantic, that offer a low grade, a low inclination, and also offer year-round accessibility. If you go further up north into past Albuquerque, into Colorado or Wyoming or Montana, those are much more arduous and treacherous cross-country trips to make. So when you're talking about time, when you're talking about wear and tear on a vehicle, whether it's a locomotive or a truck, the lower the incline, the better, and the sunnier the weather, the better. And El Paso is blessed with that. Now, that blessing also turns into a challenge, because it means everybody wants a piece of this territory, and everybody's trying to sort of exercise their control, which gets into this divergence of jurisdictions and legal structures that I mentioned earlier. So kind of the more fractured we are, the less able we are to build an economy of scale at a regional level and survive changes that are made or decided in capitals that are far away from us. So now, when we're thinking about our region and our industry and how we can take advantage of binational supply chains, I wanted to just share these final slides with you to get a sense of what's happening here with the composition of rail freight. And it really just emphasizes what I mentioned earlier at the beginning of the presentation about NAFTA being really at the service of the automotive industry, and favorably so, over the last 20 years, 24 years. So when we look at this is the freight analysis, this is US government freight analysis framework data. From El Paso to Los Angeles, the total rail freight flows are motorized vehicles, essentially. You see the blue line is the total amount, and the orange line is the amount of motorized vehicles. So that shows you again how important we are as a region, not just for the fabrication of auto parts or contributing to the supply chain of the automotive sector in both countries, but how important we are with respect to shipping those finished products to ports in Los Angeles, and how they go to the Pacific or other maritime ports in the Americas from there. The other major rail line that we have is El Paso to Houston. And it's going to sound like I'm making this up, but we, in these graphs, only wanted to show you the total amount of value that goes on these rail lines, and then the top commodity. And the top commodities we saw for El Paso to LA was motorized vehicles, and from El Paso to Houston, it's also motorized vehicles. Now, El Paso to Chicago is a bit of an anomaly here. The top commodity that goes from El Paso to Chicago on the rail is alcoholic beverages. So I guess we all know where to get beer if we're traveling across the U.S. El Paso to New Mexico total rail composition is also the second, or the first commodity is motorized vehicles. So, you know, when we look at our continent, and you see there that we're this little, well, just imagine you saw it. If you look at the center of the continent there, that white dot is white sands. And we're just to the southeast of that, at this transboundary region. And if you think about, you know, how the continent has been evolving in the last 100 years, if you think about the trade routes that have been created here in the last 150 years, and if you think about how special and how important a place El Paso and Juarez and New Mexico occupy in that history, it's really staggering. The issue, though, is that nowadays we're not just dealing with 3 countries and building an automotive supply chain with a free trade agreement. As we saw earlier, and mentioned earlier, the growth of China in its exports to both the United States and to Mexico are destabilizing this free trade agreement that was hammered out 25 years ago. And it was built on the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement, which predates even NAFTA, which was also at the service of the automotive industry between the 2 countries. So when we're thinking about challenges to Mexico manufacturing at a national level or even at a regional level, it is incumbent upon us to remember our geostrategic value as a region and the importance that our region has, both with manufacturing and both with the transportation of these automotive goods and components that support the supply chain. And it's incumbent upon us to spend more time with public policymakers, city council, state government, educational institutions, to educate us as much as possible on the vagaries and the developments of international trade and how they're affecting our 2 countries and 3 countries at the end of the day. Because after all, we're not just El Paso. We are the gateway to the world, and in many ways, we're the gateway to the future. Thank you all for your time. I was very happy to be here today.